On the 15th of October, 1993, a four-engine jet that had been designed to drop hydrogen bombs on Moscow lifted off from a Norfolk runway for the last time as part of an operational squadron. The design was 40 years old. The airframe itself had been rolling out of a Hertfordshire factory while John Kennedy was still a senator. It had been declared obsolete in 1968, made redundant by submarines, scheduled for the scrapyard, and yet here it was, more than 2 decades after that supposed retirement, still flying, still indispensable, still the only aircraft in the Royal Air Force that could do what it did. The aircraft was a Handley Page, Victor k.2. The day it landed, the last of its kind, it brought to a close the longest operational career of any V-bomber. The Valiant had been grounded in 1964, killed by metal fatigue. The Vulcan had retired in 1984, replaced by missiles and tornadoes. But the Victor, the third of the trio, the one that should have died first, somehow outlived them both. It flew through the Falklands when nothing else could reach the target. It flew through the Gulf when coalition strike packages needed fuel over the desert. It flew, and flew, and flew, long after every plan and every paper said it should be gone. This is the story of how a failed nuclear bomber became the most valuable aircraft in the Royal Air Force, and why the British kept it in the air until the very last drop of usable airframe life had been wrung out of it. To understand the Victor, you have to understand the world that built it. In August of 1946, with the rubble of the Second World War still being cleared from London streets, the British Air Staff issued Operational Requirement Number 1001. The document defined the atomic weapon itself, a bomb to be no more than 24 feet long, 5 feet across, and 10,000 pounds in weight. The following January, the Ministry of Supply followed it with Specification B.35/46, which translated Operational Requirement Number 229 into engineering language. The new specification called for a jet-powered bomber capable of carrying that 10,000-pound atomic weapon to a target 1,500 nautical miles from base, at a height of 50,000 feet, at speeds approaching the sound barrier. Nothing remotely like it existed anywhere in the world. The Americans had Hiroshima and Nagasaki behind them. The Soviets did not yet have a bomb at all, though they would test their first device in 1949. Britain, exhausted and bankrupt, had decided that survival in the new atomic age required an independent nuclear deterrent. If London were to be vaporized by a Soviet first strike, British bombers would still rise from dispersed airfields and deliver retaliation. That was the doctrine, that was the promise, and it required aircraft that did not yet exist. 3 companies answered the call. Vickers proposed the Valiant, a conservative design intended as an insurance policy in case the more ambitious projects failed. Avro proposed the Vulcan, a vast delta-winged machine that looked like something from a science fiction magazine, and Handley Page, the oldest of the 3 firms, proposed something even stranger. Their design was called the HP-80, and it had a wing unlike any wing ever flown on a heavy aircraft before. It was crescent-shaped. The leading edge swept sharply at the root, less sharply in the middle, and almost not at all near the tip. The reasoning was elegant, and it had taken Handley Page's research director, Dr. Gustav Lachmann, and his deputy Godfrey Lee the better part of a decade to refine. Lachmann was a German-born aerodynamicist who had been interned by the British during the Second World War and had used the time, with characteristic dedication, to work through the mathematics of swept-wing flight. Lee, who would within the company become known simply as Mr. Victor, did much of the detailed engineering that turned the theory into a flyable wing. Their shared insight was that the optimal angle of sweep was not a single number, but a function of how thick the wing was at any given station along the span. The thick inner section, which had to carry the engines and the structural loads from the fuselage, needed heavy sweep to delay the formation of shock waves at high speed. The thinner outer section did not, and a reduced sweep there gave better low-speed handling for takeoff and landing. Combined together, the crescent wing produced a near-constant critical Mach number across the entire span. In theory, the aircraft could cruise faster, higher, and with a heavier load than anything its rivals could manage. The wing was only the most visible of the Victor's innovations. The fuselage cross-section was carefully shaped to reduce drag at transonic speeds. The tailplane was mounted at the very tip of the swept fin, well clear of the jet exhausts, in a configuration that gave clean airflow at all speeds and angles of attack. The crew compartment was pressurized to allow operation in the stratosphere with comparative comfort, though pressure helmets were still worn at the highest altitudes. The engine intakes were buried in the wing roots, an approach that minimized drag but, as service experience would later show, also created problems for engines run hard in dense cloud. The whole airframe was a piece of aerodynamic ambition, a quiet declaration that British engineering, in a diminished post-war Britain, could still build something the rest of the world would have to take seriously. The first prototype, serial number WB771, made its maiden flight on the 24th of December 1952, lifting off from the Boscombe Down runway under the hands of test pilot squadron leader Handley. What rose into the winter sky that Christmas Eve was the most aerodynamically advanced bomber the world had yet seen. The crescent wing worked. The aircraft was faster than the Vulcan, flew higher than the Vulcan, and carried more bombs than the Vulcan. By any reasonable measure, the Victor was the best of the 3 V-bombers Britain produced. Production B.1 aircraft, powered by 4 Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire turbojets, entered service with No. 10 Squadron at Royal Air Force Cottesmore in April of 1958. 50 were built. They carried free-fall nuclear weapons, including the Yellow Sun gravity bomb that represented Britain's first operational thermonuclear capability. They flew at 50,000 feet, dressed in white anti-flash paint, ready at 4 minutes' notice to launch towards Soviet cities. The B.2, with its longer wings and far more powerful Rolls-Royce Conway turbofan engines, followed in 1961. It could climb above 60,000 feet. It could carry the Blue Steel standoff nuclear missile, allowing it to launch its weapon from outside the range of Soviet defenses. On paper, in the briefing rooms, in the optimistic memoranda passing between the Air Ministry and Whitehall, the Victor was a triumph. The triumph lasted about as long as it took the Soviet Union to deploy a single weapon system. On the 1st of May 1960, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft was shot down over Sverdlovsk by a Soviet S, a 75 surface-to-air missile. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was captured alive. The wreckage was paraded in Moscow, and every Western planner who looked at the photographs understood the same thing. High-altitude bombers were no longer safe. The 50,000-foot ceiling that had been the Victor's defining advantage was now its death sentence. A Soviet missile could reach that height in less than a minute. Anything flying straight and level above the Iron Curtain at 60,000 feet would be a target, not a threat. The shock of this realization cannot be overstated. Every aspect of British, American, and Soviet bomber doctrine had been built on the assumption that altitude meant safety. Aircraft were optimized for it. Crews were trained for it. The whole logic of the strategic deterrent assumed that a bomber climbing into the stratosphere could deliver its weapon before any defender could intercept. Powers' aircraft was flying at 70,000 feet when it was hit. There was now nowhere high enough to hide. The Royal Air Force responded with one of the more painful doctrinal reversals in its history. The V-bomber force, designed from the rivets up to operate at extreme altitude, was ordered down. The new mission profile was low-level penetration, hug the ground, fly under the radar. Approach the target at 250 feet above the Earth, where Soviet missile guidance struggled and interceptor pilots could not see you against the clutter. The bombers were repainted from the gleaming white of high altitude into a dark green and grey camouflage scheme suited to terrain following. Crews who had trained for years to deliver weapons from the stratosphere were retrained to fly at hilltop height through valleys, navigating by ground features, watching for power lines and church spires. The Vulcan, with its enormous delta wing and rugged structure, took to the new role surprisingly well. The big wing produced a smooth ride at low altitude, and the airframe could absorb the punishing turbulence. The Victor could not. The crescent wing that had been so brilliant at 60,000 feet was ill-suited to the dense, rough air down low. The aircraft was never structurally designed for sustained low-level flight, and the airframe began accumulating fatigue at a rate that alarmed every engineer who studied it. The wing root, where the spar met the fuselage, was the critical area. Every gust, every maneuver, every minute of low-altitude turbulence worked the metal a little harder than it had been intended to be worked. Inspection schedules, originally planned around a high-altitude career, had to be rewritten. The aircraft were grounded periodically for the kind of structural surveys that nuclear bombers should not have needed. By 1968, just 7 years after the B.2 entered service, the Victor bomber force was finished. Number 100 Squadron and Number 139 Squadron stood their aircraft down. The Royal Navy had taken over Britain's strategic deterrent with the Polaris submarine. The Victor, as a nuclear bomber, was redundant. The aircraft had cost millions to develop. It had served as a frontline weapon for less than a decade. Its wings were tired, its mission was gone, and the company that had built it was sliding toward bankruptcy. By every conventional measure, the story should have ended there. Aircraft that find themselves obsolete and unwanted at the same time are not aircraft that have long futures. What saved the Victor was a problem that nobody had quite solved, in any air force, anywhere in the world. The problem was distance. Modern jet aircraft burned fuel at rates that would have horrified the propeller pioneers. A fighter taking off from a British base could not, by itself, reach the North Sea oil platforms it was supposed to defend. A bomber leaving for the Mediterranean could not, by itself, return to base. The solution had been understood since the 1920s. You refuel the aircraft in the air, transferring fuel from a flying tanker through a hose, while both aircraft maintained formation. Britain had pioneered the technology. A company called Flight Refuelling Limited, founded by Sir Alan Cobham in 1934, and had developed the probe and drogue system that became the Western standard. The principle was straightforward. The tanker trailed a long, flexible hose with a basket on the end. The receiver flew a probe mounted on its nose into the basket. Spring-loaded valves opened, fuel flowed, and the receiver topped up its tanks while traveling at 300 knots, in the dark, often in cloud, with no margin for error. The Americans had taken a different path. United States Air Force tankers used a rigid telescoping boom, operated by a specialist crew member lying prone in the rear of the aircraft, who flew the boom into a receptacle on the receiver's spine. The boom system delivered fuel at much higher rates than the probe and drogue, which made it ideal for refueling heavy bombers, but it required a dedicated boom operator and worked with only one receiver at a time. The American approach also produced a single dominant tanker, the Boeing KC-135, of which more than 700 were built between 1957 and 1965. The United States Air Force could afford to build a tanker fleet from scratch, around a single optimized airframe, in numbers that no other nation could match. The KC-135 became the workhorse of the Western Alliance, available wherever the Americans went, and, on occasion, available to allies who needed it. The Soviets, with their characteristic preference for adapting existing platforms, modified their Tu-16 Badger bombers into tankers, using a wingtip-to-wingtip refueling system that was peculiar to Soviet practice. It worked, but it was difficult, and Soviet long-range air operations remained constrained by the limitations of the technique throughout the Cold War. Britain's first dedicated jet tanker had been the Vickers Valiant, the same Valiant that had been built as the conservative insurance policy of the V-bomber program. Valiant tankers had served the Royal Air Force well from the early 1960s, equipped with a single centerline hose drum unit and serving the same probe and drogue receivers as the rest of the British fleet. And then, in the autumn of 1964, the entire Valiant fleet was grounded almost overnight. Inspections had revealed catastrophic metal fatigue in the wing spars, caused in part by the same low-level penetration roll that was now placing similar stresses on the Victor. The aircraft were not repairable in any economic sense. Some had cracks visible to the naked eye. By the end of the year, every Valiant in Royal Air Force service had been withdrawn, and Britain had lost its tanker capability completely. This was a strategic disaster. Without tankers, fighters had to be ferried across the Atlantic in stages, taking days. Long-range reconnaissance became impossible. Any deployment of British air power beyond the immediate continental theatre depended on borrowed American support. The air staff demanded an emergency replacement, and they demanded it in months, not years. The only aircraft available with the size, the engines, and the structural capacity to be converted quickly were the surplus Victor B.1s, sitting in storage with their bomber career, ended by the very same shift to low-level flight that had ended the Valiant's life. 6 of them were rushed through a hasty conversion at Handley Page's Radlett factory. 2 refueling pods were fitted under the wings, fed from extra fuel tanks in the bomb bay. The first conversion flew on the 28th of April 1965. By August, No. 55 Squadron at Royal Air Force Marham had become operational in the tanker role. It was a stopgap. The wing pods could only deliver fuel at rates suitable for fighters. They could not refuel another bomber. The aircraft retained the ability to drop bombs as well, hence the awkward designation B.1 AK-2P. Nobody believed this was a long-term solution. The tankers existed because something had to fill the gap left by the Valiant, and the Victor was the only aircraft in the inventory that could do it. But the gap kept widening. The Royal Air Force discovered, mission by mission, that air-to-air refueling was not a luxury. It was a multiplier of national power. A single tanker could keep a fighter airborne for hours instead of minutes. A pair of tankers could escort a bomber to a target that would otherwise have been unreachable. The aircraft that did the refueling were, in real strategic terms, more valuable than many of the aircraft they refueled. Without them, the rest of the Air Force could not function at any meaningful range. By the late 1960s, with the B.1 tankers already showing fatigue from their second career, the Royal Air Force needed something more capable. The answer was sitting in storage at Royal Air Force Radlett. The B.2 bombers, retired from the nuclear role, were larger, more powerful, and had far greater fuel capacity than the B.1s. If they could be converted into tankers, they would solve the problem for a generation. Handley Page, which had built the aircraft, prepared a detailed conversion proposal in 1967. The Ministry of Defence accepted the proposal, in principle. Then it delayed signing the contract. Months passed, then years. By the time the ministry was finally ready to commit, in February of 1970, Handley Page Limited had collapsed into liquidation. The company that designed the Victor, that knew every rivet and every fitting in the airframe, no longer existed. The conversion contract was awarded instead to Hawker Siddeley at Woodford. Hawker Siddeley engineers, working from the original drawings and from the failed Handley Page proposal, devised something simpler and in some ways more clever. They could not afford the fuel-tipped tanks Handley Page had planned, which would have added weight and complicated the wing structure. Instead, they did the opposite. They removed 18 inches from each wingtip. The shorter wing reduced bending stress at the root, where the worst fatigue cracks were forming, and effectively bought the aircraft thousands of additional flying hours of structural life. The decision was counterintuitive. Aircraft are usually improved by adding wing area, not by removing it. But the Hawker Siddeley engineers understood that this aircraft was not going to be flown for performance. It was going to be flown for endurance, and endurance was a function of how long the metal could be trusted before it cracked. The bomb aimer's glazed nose was replaced with a metal panel. The bomb bay was filled with 2 large permanent fuel tanks. A high-capacity hose drum unit, designated the Mk-17B, was installed in the rear fuselage on the center line, capable of pumping fuel at 3 times the rate of the wing pods. The wing pods themselves, designated Mk-20B, were retained for refueling fighters. With 3 hoses, the Victor could now refuel 3 aircraft simultaneously, or transfer enormous quantities to a single thirsty receiver. The wiring, the plumbing, and the cockpit instrumentation had to be redesigned to accommodate the new role. The crew of 5, 2 pilots, 2 navigators, and an air electronics officer, was retained, but their workload shifted. The navigators, who had once plotted bomb runs over Soviet cities, now plotted refueling rendezvous over the North Sea and the Atlantic. The air electronics officer managed the hose drum units and monitored fuel transfer rates rather than electronic countermeasures. The first converted aircraft, serial number XL231, flew as a k.2 on the 1st of March 1972 from the Woodford runway. 24 of them would eventually be produced, drawn from the surviving B.2 and BSR.2 airframes. The aircraft was now powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Conway Arco.17 engines, each producing 20,600 pounds of thrust. The Conway was a remarkable engine in its own right, the world's first production turbofan, originally developed for the cancelled Vickers V1000 strategic transport project and later fitted to civilian aircraft, including the Boeing 707 and the Douglas DC-8. In Royal Air Force service, the Conway powered the Vickers VC-10 as well as the Victor, and the commonality of engines between the VC-10 and the Victor would, in time, simplify the eventual transition between platforms. The k.2 could carry 91,000 pounds of fuel, more than 41,000 kilograms, and an astonishing quantity for an aircraft of its era. It could cruise at 640 miles per hour. It had a ceiling of 59,000 feet and a ferry range of 3,500 miles. It was, by any sensible definition, a magnificent flying fuel station. What it was not, by any sensible definition, was new. The airframes had been built between 1960 and 1963. By the time the conversions were complete, every K.2 was a decade old before it ever flew its first tanker sortie. The wings had spent years carrying nuclear weapons at low level. The metal had been worked, flexed, and fatigued by missions for which it had never truly been designed. The clock was ticking on every airframe, and yet, mission by mission, sortie by sortie, the K.2 refused to give up its place. The reason was simple, and it cut against everything that procurement officials and treasury officers preferred to believe. The aircraft was simply very good at the job. Nothing else in the British inventory could do what it did, and nothing was likely to for years to come. Here is where the Victor's strange second life really begins to make sense. The British armed forces were, throughout the 1970s and 80s, in a permanent state of financial constraint. There was never enough money for new aircraft, never enough money for 2 replacement programs when one would do, never enough money to retire a serviceable platform before its successor was ready. Every defence review demanded cuts. Every white paper proposed efficiencies. The Royal Air Force learned to extract the maximum possible service life from every airframe it owned. The Victor, expensive to develop and orphaned by the bankruptcy of its maker, became the symbol of this philosophy. It would fly until it absolutely could not fly any longer, and not one day before. The constraint was severe, but it bred a deep, granular expertise. The engineers at Royal Air Force Marham, where the entire surviving Victor force was concentrated, developed an understanding of the aircraft that no other operator in the world possessed. They knew which airframes had cracks forming where. They knew which wings had been worked harder than others. They knew which engines preferred to start in cold weather, and which had quirks in the fuel system. The squadrons, number 55 and number 57, contained crews who had flown nothing else for years. Navigators who could find a refueling rendezvous in the middle of the Atlantic by dead reckoning if the inertial system failed, and captains who could complete a join-up in cloud thick enough to hide the wingtips. This was institutional memory of the kind that cannot be bought. It can only be grown. Then, on the 2nd of April 1982, Argentine forces invaded the Falkland Islands, and every assumption about the future of the Victor force was overturned in a single weekend. The military problem facing the British government in that first week of April was, in plain terms, geometric. The Falkland Islands lay in the South Atlantic, 8,000 miles from the United Kingdom. The nearest available airfield in friendly hands was Wideawake, on Ascension Island, an isolated volcanic outcrop almost exactly halfway between Britain and the Falklands. From Wideawake to Port Stanley was 3,900 miles. The combat radius of an unrefueled Avro Vulcan was about 2,500 miles. The arithmetic was brutal. The aircraft could not reach the target and return without refueling multiple times, in flight, over open ocean, in the South Atlantic, in autumn. There was no precedent for this. Nothing remotely like it had ever been attempted by any air force at any point in history. The longest bombing mission in the Second World War, the famous Tokyo raids by B-29s from the Mariana Islands, had been 3,000 miles. The Vulcan would have to fly nearly twice that distance, drop its bombs in the dark on a defended airfield, and find its way back. The aircraft could not do this alone. The aircraft could only do this if a chain of tankers, perfectly coordinated, transferred fuel to it at calculated intervals all the way south, and then again on the way home. The tanker force available for this task was the Victor K.2. 23 aircraft, the oldest by then more than 20 years old in the airframe, operated by 2 squadrons at Royal Air Force Marham. They had not been designed for this. They had not been planned for this. The very idea of supporting an attack on the southern hemisphere from a base near the equator, using an aircraft that had been built to carry hydrogen bombs over Germany, was the sort of scenario no peacetime planner would have wasted ink considering. And yet the Victor crews accepted the mission, and they made it work. The first 5 Victors deployed to Wideawake on the 18th of April 1982, only 16 days after the invasion. Within a week, the number on ascension had grown to 14. They were modified rapidly with American-supplied carousel inertial navigation systems and Omega long-range radio navigation gear, because the existing kit had never been intended for trans-hemispheric work. The bomb aimer's nose glazing on several aircraft, removed during the k.2 conversion, was hastily reintroduced and fitted with F-95 cameras so the Victors could conduct reconnaissance of South Georgia ahead of the British landing. On the night of the 30th of April, the first Black Buck mission was launched. The plan, drawn up on a wall-sized chart at Marham and at Waddington, called for 15 Victor sorties to support a single Vulcan strike against the runway at Port Stanley. 11 Victors would fly south alongside the bomber, refueling it and each other in a complex relay, with calculated turn-back points, where each tanker would peel off and head home as its own fuel reserves dictated. 2 more Victors were held in reserve. 2 would launch later to recover the returning Vulcan and tankers. The attacking Vulcan, XM607, would be refueled 7 times on the way out and once on the way back, consuming an astonishing quantity of fuel, all of it lifted into the air by aircraft that had been declared obsolete more than a decade earlier. The mission departed shortly before midnight. Almost immediately, the careful plan began to come apart. The primary Vulcan suffered a pressurization failure when a rubber seal on the captain's side window perished in flight and was forced to return to ascension. The reserve Vulcan, captained by Flight Lieutenant Martin Withers, took over. One of the Victors developed a fault in its hose drum unit and aborted, replaced by a reserve. As the formation pressed south through the night, fuel consumption ran higher than predicted because the Vulcan was carrying more weight than the planners had expected. The crisis came at the final tanker bracket, hours into the flight, deep in the South Atlantic, in the middle of a violent electrical storm. The 2 Victors involved, XL-189 flown by Squadron Leader Bob Tuxford and XH-669 flown by Flight Lieutenant Steve Biglands, were attempting to transfer fuel from Tuxford's aircraft to Biglands' aircraft, so that Biglands could then fly on with the Vulcan and deliver the final refueling before the bombing run. Mid-transfer, Biglands' refueling probe broke. The aircraft could not receive any more fuel. The plan called for XH-669 to be the final tanker, the one that would take the Vulcan to its last refueling point. Tuxford and Biglands made an instant decision in the dark cockpit, in radio silence, in the storm. They reversed roles. Biglands, with his broken probe, gave back what fuel he could spare and turned for ascension. Tuxford absorbed the fuel he had just transferred and pressed on south to refuel the Vulcan. The decision committed Tuxford to a flight home that he could not, by any margin, complete on the fuel he had remaining. He continued anyway. He delivered the fuel. The Vulcan went on to bomb Port Stanley Airfield and place a single 1,000-pound bomb directly across the runway centerline. Tuxford, returning north, had insufficient fuel to reach ascension. A reserve tanker was launched from Wideawake to meet him. He was 600 miles out, with 30 minutes of fuel remaining, when he saw the navigation lights of the rescue aircraft turning toward him in the early dawn. The Vulcan, similarly desperate, met its own returning tanker in another emergency rendezvous. Both aircraft landed safely. The mission, Black Buck 1, was, at the time, the longest bombing mission in history, 8,000 miles, 16 hours in the air. It was the k.2 that made it possible. Without those aircraft, it could not have been attempted. 6 more Black Buck missions followed. Black Buck 2, on the 4th of May, was a second attempt against the Port Stanley runway, again with a Vulcan and the supporting tanker chain. Black Buck 3 was cancelled due to weather. Black Bucks 5 and 6, flown on the 31st of May and the 3rd of June, were anti-radar strikes using American-supplied Shrike missiles improvised onto the Vulcan's wing pylons, intended to suppress the Argentine Westinghouse TPS-43 radar at Stanley. Black Buck 6 ended dramatically when the Vulcan's refueling probe broke during the return journey, forcing the aircraft to divert to Rio de Janeiro and intern itself for several days under Brazilian control until diplomatic arrangements allowed its release. Black Buck 7, on the 12th of June, was a final conventional bombing raid against troop positions outside Stanley, flown again by Withers in XM607. In every case, the same handful of Victor airframes, flying repeatedly, lifted ton after ton of fuel into the South Atlantic sky to keep the British attack alive. The cost in airframe hours was enormous. The k.2 fleet flew over 3,000 hours during the Falklands campaign and conducted more than 500 operational sorties from Ascension Island, a sortie rate roughly 3 times the peacetime norm. Each hour of that frantic activity drew down the structural life of aircraft that already had too few hours left. Beyond Black Buck, the Victors were doing other work that has received less attention but mattered just as much. They refueled the Nimrod maritime patrol aircraft on long-range patrols, searching for Argentine submarines. They refueled the Hercules transport aircraft that air-dropped supplies to the British task force at sea, including spare parts and mail, and on at least one occasion replacement aircrew. They escorted Sea Harrier fighters being ferried south from Yeovilton, refueling them in stages to extend their range across the Atlantic. They flew a remarkable strategic reconnaissance mission on the night of the 20th of April, when XL-192, captained by squadron leader John Elliott, and 4 supporting tankers carried out a radar mapping sortie around South Georgia. The lead aircraft was airborne for nearly 15 hours and covered roughly 7,000 miles, providing the British task force with intelligence on Argentine naval movements that could not have been obtained any other way. Without the k.2, none of these things would have been possible. When the Argentine garrison surrendered on the 14th of June 1982, the Victor had become something extraordinary. It had performed a role for which it had not been designed, in conditions for which it had not been planned, at a tempo that no one had imagined, and it had succeeded utterly. The aircraft that should have been retired in 1968 had, in 1982, just executed one of the most demanding tanker operations in the history of military aviation. This success came at a price. By 1986, the worst-worn airframes had to be withdrawn. Number 57, Squadron was disbanded that June. From then on, only Number 55 Squadron at Marham continued to operate the type. The fleet was contracting, its remaining hours being carefully husbanded against an uncertain future. The Vickers VC-10 conversions were beginning to enter service to replace the Victor in the tanker role. Plans were drawn up for the k.2's final retirement, projected for some date in the early 1990s. In the years between the Falklands and the Gulf, the surviving Victors went back to the routine that had defined the tanker force since the 1960s. They refueled Lightnings and later Phantoms and Tornadoes scrambled to intercept Soviet long-range patrol aircraft that probed British airspace on a near-weekly basis throughout the late Cold War. They flew exercises with North Atlantic Treaty Organization partners. They ferried fighters to and from deployments. The aircraft were no longer at the center of any war, but they remained quietly indispensable, the unglamorous backbone of British air operations across the North Atlantic theater. Maintenance crews at Marham learned to nurse the airframes through fatigue cycles, replacing components at the first sign of wear, husbanding spare parts that were no longer in production from any source. The Victor became, in those years, something close to a custom-built aircraft, where every airframe had its own personality, and every airframe was kept flying through the dedicated attention of people who had become specialists in this aircraft alone. Then, in August of 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and once again the world rearranged itself around the question of who could move fuel through the air. The coalition response to the Iraqi invasion required strike packages of unprecedented scale, operating across enormous distances in the Middle East. British Tornado bombers, deploying out of bases in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, would penetrate Iraqi airspace at low level to attack airfields and command centers. They needed tanker support, outbound and inbound. The Royal Air Force committed every tanker it possessed to the operation. 8 Victor k.2s were deployed to Muharraq Air Base in Bahrain in December of 1990, supplementing the VC-10s. The aircraft were now, in the most literal sense, museum pieces being asked to fight a modern war. They were operated by crews who had trained for years on a platform their juniors had never flown. The maintenance teams at Muharraq performed daily miracles to keep the airframes serviceable in the desert heat, with sand fouling intakes that had been designed for the cool, damp air of East Anglia. Of the 10 Victors that ultimately participated in Operation Granby, the Royal Air Force designation for the Gulf War, 6 were given nose art for the campaign. XM715 became Tizin Tina. XM717 became Lucky Lou. XH-672, the same airframe that had flown on Black Buck 1, became Maid Marian. They flew from Bahrain on what was nicknamed the Olive Low Trail, a tanker track south of the Iraqi border where strike aircraft topped up before pressing north to their targets. Tornadoes, Buccaneers, Jaguars, even American Navy aircraft on occasion, all drew from the Victor's hoses. The Victor force was tasked with 299 sorties during Operation Granby. It flew every one of them. Not one was missed for any reason of mechanical failure or unavailability. A 100% operational availability rate, achieved by airframes pushing 30 years of age, was a record not matched by any other Royal Air Force aircraft type during the campaign. Maid Marian alone accumulated 52 refueling tallies during Granby. They were represented as black petrol pump silhouettes painted aft of the crew door, the highest score in the Victor force. When Iraq surrendered in February of 1991, the Victor had earned, for a second time, the right to keep flying, but the airframes were now genuinely at the end. The fatigue clocks were unforgiving. The replacement VC-10s and Lockheed TriStars were in service in adequate numbers. The decision was made to let the Victor go, with full honours, in its 35th year of service. The final retirement was ceremonial in a way that few military aircraft ever achieve. Through the summer and autumn of 1993, individual aircraft made their last flights to museums, to gate guard plinths, to fire training schools. XH-672, Maid Marian, the last Victor ever to fly, landed at Royal Air Force Shawbury on the 30th of November 1993 for preservation at the Royal Air Force Museum. XL-231, the very first k.2 conversion, flew to the Yorkshire Air Museum at Elvington on the 25th of November, where it remains in ground operational condition to this day. Its Conway engines still capable of being fired up for public demonstrations. Number 55. Squadron disbanded at Royal Air Force Marham on the 15th of October 1993. With its disbandment, the V-bomber era came to an end. The Valiant had been gone for 29 years. The Vulcan had been gone for 9. The Victor, the aircraft that had been written off as obsolete in 1968, was the last to leave the stage. The question that hangs over this story is the obvious one. Why did Britain keep this aircraft flying for so long? The Americans, at the same time, were operating tanker fleets numbered in the hundreds, with multiple aircraft types and the resources to replace them on a regular cycle. The Soviets had developed their own tanker variant of the Tu-16 and were beginning to introduce the dedicated Il-78. The French had a national tanker fleet based on converted civilian airliners. In every other major air force, a 30-year-old converted bomber would have been retired and replaced long before 1993. Britain kept the Victor because Britain, by the late 20th century, had become extraordinarily good at extending the useful life of expensive equipment beyond its original design intent. This was not a virtue in any abstract sense. It was a necessity born of constraint. Defense budgets that had funded the original V-bomber program of the 1950s had shrunk in real terms by the 1970s. Replacement programs for every category of aircraft, from fighters to maritime patrol to transport, competed for the same shrinking pool of money. The Victor survived, in part, because no one could find the funds to replace it sooner. But aging equipment is not the same thing as obsolete equipment, and Britain seemed to understand the distinction more clearly than anyone else. The airframe, the engines, the fuel system, the crew positions were not obsolete. They were merely matched to a role that no longer existed. When a new role appeared, the same airframe was found to be excellent at it, and remained excellent for another generation. But there was also something else, something deeper that ran through the whole story. The Royal Air Force had built a culture, around the V-bomber force and especially around the Victor, of treating individual airframes as long-term investments to be carefully managed, rather than expendable items to be cycled through service. The maintenance philosophy at Marham assumed that an aircraft would fly for decades, and the engineering practice followed. Detailed fatigue records were kept on every airframe. Wing route inspections were performed on schedules tighter than the manufacturer had originally specified. Engine overhaul cycles were tracked component by component. The aircraft were not pushed harder than the records said they could be pushed, but they were pushed up to that limit and never wasted. The crews, in their turn, accumulated experience that became a national asset rather than an individual one. Captains who had refueled fighters over the North Sea in the 1970s became the instructors who taught the Falklands generation, and those pilots, in turn, taught the Gulf War generation. The institutional knowledge of how to operate this particular aircraft, in this particular role, with these particular quirks, did not have to be relearned from a manual every few years. It was held in human memory, passed down at Maham officers' mess from one squadron to the next, and it produced operational outcomes that were not achievable elsewhere. There is a final point, less often noted, that explains why the British found the Victor so hard to replace. The aircraft was, in the tanker role, surprisingly well matched to its mission. It had been designed for a different mission, true, but the qualities that made it a good high-altitude bomber, the immense fuel capacity, the long range, the powerful engines, the stable airframe at cruise, were the same qualities that made it a good tanker. 3 refueling points, 91,000 pounds of transferable fuel, the ability to operate from existing Royal Air Force runways with established support infrastructure. There was nothing mediocre about the k.2 as a tanker. It was, on the day it retired, still one of the most capable refueling platforms in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization inventory. Other nations might have scrapped the aircraft and built something new. Britain could not afford to, and so it did something cleverer. It worked out what the aircraft was actually good for, in the changed circumstances of the changed world, and kept it. The Victor flew for 35 years in Royal Air Force service. It served as a high-altitude nuclear bomber, a low-level penetration bomber, a strategic reconnaissance platform, and a strategic tanker. It bombed nothing in anger, but enabled the bombing of Argentine positions in the South Atlantic and Iraqi positions in Kuwait. It outlived the company that built it by 23 years. It outlived the doctrine for which it had been designed by 3 decades. And when it finally retired, it did so not because anything better had been built, but because the metal had simply, at last, run out of useful life. Somewhere over the Atlantic on the night of the 30th of April 1982, in radio silence, in a thunderstorm, with a broken refueling probe and a Vulcan needing fuel, 2 Victor crews made a decision that could only be made by men who knew their aircraft as well as they knew their own hands. The aircraft had been designed in the 1940s, built in the 1960s, and modified in the 1970s. By any reasonable accounting, it should not have been there at all. It was there because the British, over and over again, had refused to throw it away. And on that night, in that storm, the patience of 3 decades paid the only debt that ever really mattered. The mission flew. The bomb fell. The crews came home. The Victor k.2 carried 91,000 pounds of fuel. What it actually carried, for 35 years, was the strategic reach of a nation that could no longer afford to build the aircraft it needed, and so kept the aircraft it had, until the aircraft and the era ended together.